This is the CP554 Diode Bridge Compressor from Herc. I currently have these two in a stereo pair strapped across a drum bus for the purposes of this demonstration, but you can use these on a master bus, bass, guitars, vocals, anything that you would like. I have these stereo linked via the socket on the back of each card. As you can see, these are not in adjoining slots. Even if they were, the traditional compressor bus link on the back of some 500 series units does not work with the 554. The unit uses a very different type of stereo linking, which also means if you have a complex chain with the 554s not next to each other, you can link them with a single cable. It does have two prongs on the back of each card. You only need to connect one. As we turn on the units, from the bypass buttons with everything just at noon apart from the gain makeup, which is at 0, you will hear quite a significant difference. As you can see, the LEDs for the gain reduction move very, very quickly. This is actually quite similar to other diode bridge compressors which use classic VU needles, but it's the needle itself on the older models that moves very slowly, not the compression. This is much more accurate a reflection of what diode bridge compression actually does than most of the vintage units. Below the bypass button, which turns on the compression, is vintage mode, and vintage mode adds a lot of emulation of the analog harmonics and saturation that you might get from traditional transformers. It's all done in an analog way, there is no digital modeling involved, but you should hear when I turn these on significantly more heft and weight and size from the sound. This is entirely because of the analog saturation. Now, if the compression is too much on the low end, quite often this happens with a drum kit or a very heavy bass guitar, then you can use the fixed high pass filter, the button that says HPF 150 Hz. This means that now anything below that 150 affecting the compression. It doesn't remove anything below 150 Hz from the signal, so we still have lots of low end. In fact, on a bass heavy signal, we should now hear more low end because the low end is not now affecting the amount of compression. Under particularly heavy compression, this will definitely help to reduce pumping artifacts if that's something that you need. This is particularly relevant in modern production where too much pumping on a compressor can be a real negative, especially across something like a master bus. Below these we have the controls that you would find on most typical compressors. The first one being the threshold. So at analog 0, that's roughly -18 to -20 decibels in terms of digital. That's the threshold as set in the middle, but then we can reduce the threshold or increase if we want more or less compression on the same source. Below that is the ratio control, which goes from a gentle 1.5 to 1 to a fairly aggressive 8 to 1. It's a variable control, unlike the more traditional diode bridge compressors, which means we can dial in exactly the ratio that we want. We can hear that at 8:1 ratio, the compression really is quite aggressive. I'm going to leave the ratio all the way up at 8:1 while we talk about attack and release so that we can really hear what those controls do. Starting with attack. Attack is the amount of signal that is not being affected by the compression, meaning that the original attack of the sound can be kept. For example, this is really good to use a slower attack on drums to let the initial hit of a drum through. On vocals, it may be the opposite, that we want to smooth out the attack so that initial sibilants on a vocal don't come through far louder than the rest of the vocal. In this way, the attack control can be used to increase the perceived amount of attack on something like a drum source, and then you would use the gain makeup afterwards to then bring the overall level back so that that initial attack is then greatened. Now, the yin and yang of attack and release, now we're looking at recovery, which is the traditional name for release. The release on this unit can go from a very slow 2.5 seconds at the far right, all the way to an incredibly quick 50 milliseconds, which will give a very distorted, crunchy kind of sound because the compressor is recovered very quickly and producing lots of possibly desirable artifacts. And last but not least is gain makeup. If the compression is very heavily squashing the signal, you will notice that the overall level is decreased, and you can use the gain makeup to compensate for that. Very often with heavy compression, especially in vintage mode, you may not need very much in the way of gain makeup because the perceived loudness of the compression is going to make things seem louder even if the meters register slightly less. So there we have it, the CP554, available now from herkshop.eu.